Stanford University.
Drop this again too. Yeah. The audio is not working.
There you go. No, it is. Yeah.
All right. Welcome everyone to CS 547. If you're taking the class for credit, there's sheets that go around. Should be one on each side. So make sure to sign it and pass it around.
I put the exam out in the back to pick up too.
All right. Next week we have Monica Lamb, who's a professor here in CS, and her work's on creating open platforms for social interaction. One of her projects is this system to easily and privately exchange information with people at a party. So it should be pretty interesting. I'm not going to be here, but Bill Verplank will be here to introduce the speaker. Should be an interesting one. Are there any questions? Probably not. Okay. This week we have...
They want to hear the speaker first. Thanks.
Gregory Abowd, who is a distinguished professor.
Gray hair?
Yeah, that's where the distinguished comes in. At Georgia Tech, which is my alma mater. And he's in the School of Interactive Computing. He's the director of the Health Systems Institute and the former director of the Aware Home at Georgia Tech. Let's see here. I got notes. There's actually quite a long list. Gregory attended Notre Dame and did his undergrad in mathematics. Then he moved on to University of Oxford, where he did his PhD in computation, and was there as a Rhodes Scholar. Is that the same scholarship that Bill Clinton had?
Yes, but I did inhale. No, just kidding.
What's that?
Nothing. I was there when Mike McFall was there, who's a faculty member here.
Anyone? No. So Gregory is also an ACM fellow, a member of the Chi Academy, a recipient of the ACM Sig Chi Social Impact Award. He's also a recipient of the ACM Eugene Lawler Humanitarian Award. He's also a mentor. He has graduated, I believe, 14 or 15 PhD students?
18.
18. And what, about 12 of those have gone on to teach at other HCI schools, top HCI schools? So there's
Something
a lot
like
of Gregory children out there. And a whole bunch, another 12
I
or so.
referred to them once as fruit of my academic loins, but I was told that was inappropriate.
He also is a father of 3 children. 2 of his boys are on the autism spectrum, and I'm sure provide daily inspiration and firsthand experience that inform the research he'll talk about today. And with that, I'll hand it over to Gregory.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having me here. So just to give you a quick summary of what I'm going to try to talk about, I'll give a little bit of personal motivation, historical background as to why I'm doing work in autism. And as Stephen had said, I have children with autism, so that's a lot to do with it, but it's a little more than just that. And then what I wanted to do was to give a survey of a number of projects over the last not quite a decade, where I and a number of my students and colleagues have been looking at different opportunities for being able to apply information technologies to address different challenges relating to autism. But the reason I refer to this talk as computing and autism is that the overriding message here is that there are lots of different computer science or computing perspectives and research agendas that can address interesting challenges in autism. So some of them have to do with work in human-centered or human-computer interaction, but others of them have to do with other domains within computer science and computing in general. And in fact, what I wanted mostly to do is to try to motivate people in the audience here to think about how you might attack work with intellectual vigor that has meaning outside of the community in which you would publish that work. And I'd also like to learn from you, because I think there's some expertise in the room here that might be able to inform me in some of the problems that I'm going to pose to you, some of which I've done little more than just think about, haven't done anything with them. And I welcome any interruptions at any point. I think we're supposed to stop at 2 o'clock. And as you'll see, that I get fairly passionate about these topics, which is a nice way of saying I sometimes don't pay attention to the clock, so I apologize in advance if I go too long. But I'll get into the bit of the personal history here. So it turns out, in retrospect, 1998 was a very important year for me. That was the year that we got money from the state of Georgia to build a laboratory that was a house that became the site of the Aware Home Research Initiative. It was also the year in November that my father died, and I'll explain why that is relevant. And it was also the year that, in retrospect, that my oldest son changed before my very eyes. And it's those last 2 points that are particularly relevant here, that introduced challenges in my life that turned into wonderful opportunities that I'm, in retrospect, very, very grateful for. So first, a little bit about my dad, which is about myself and my family. So my dad was an 8mm film enthusiast. So I don't know how many of you remember that form of being able to record, but my memories of my father during most family activities was him sitting there either with a tripod in front of him or with a handheld camera that would have a 2-minute reel on it. It was wonderful back in the days when you had to edit at the point of recording because you had limited amount of media to hold the experiences that you were trying to record. The worst thing we did as a family was in Christmas in 1984, we bought my father his first VCR camcorder so that he could set it up and let it run for 2 hours without having to edit whatsoever, and so produced lots and lots more recorded history that people were less and less likely to go back and view. But when we had this, and the other thing about my family is I'm the 10th of 12 children. Yes, we were Catholic, and that had lots of places that we would travel, lots of events that got recorded. So lots of these very interesting memories. And unfortunately, my dad was the reason why we were able to watch these things, because he could keep the 8mm projector alive and kicking. And what we used to do often as a family was sit down, and he would sit down every year and take all of the recordings from that given year and splice them together into about an hour's reel. And so we had this cabinet of every year from 1955 to 1983 that were these 8mm and super 8mm reels we could pull out, put them on the projector, and watch as a family. So we could watch 1967. But we couldn't do something like, I want to see all the Christmases in the 60s and be able to view that. So what I did with some students was to create an annotation system that we digitized all the movies and created a system that allowed you to watch the film and annotate them with a user-defined hierarchy of metadata tags, and you tried to use some smarts to make it easy and faster for someone to annotate, but we weren't terribly successful at that. And I did publish a paper on this, but really I did this for personal reasons because I wanted to be able to more easily browse the archive and share the archive and to be able to do a variety of other things. But it was successful enough, and my family loved this particular tool because we could produce DVDs that were literally the Christmas from the 60s. I could give them all as Christmas presents, and they absolutely loved this, and I loved being able to do it. So what I did one day was I was recording, converting my own family movies from about 1997, when my oldest son Aiden was born, to, I think that was 2001 or 2002, and I was just recording them, converting them all one evening. So I set up the camcorder, was playing them and digitizing them, and I could see on a monitor the progress of what was going on. And I stepped in at 2 different occasions, and I saw 2 different scenes of my son. This first one I'm going to show you is from around Christmas time in Chicago. So the woman there is my wife, and I'm sorry that it's a little dark there, and I hope you can hear what's going on here. But this is a...
No.
Parents of their first son, very happy to record and show
What else do
his
we have here?
behavior.
What's this?
Doing interesting things like pointing at objects in the room, kind of saying what they are. He's only 18 months old. He's a boy.
Man. Picture of a man. And star.
So I'm just going to play this out for a while. You're going to see him start to point to body parts, which is a common thing you try to do to show that you have actually given birth to the most intelligent being on the,
Hey,
on the
Aiden?
planet.
Where's your nose?
Okay, so he came close. Give him a
Close.
break.
That's pretty
He's
close.
got to warm up. He's got to
Where's
get
your
into it.
nose? Where's your mouth? Mouth?
One thing I like
Where's your
here.
ears? Oh, Oh, don't act like you forgot.
You see how his eyes
your
kind of
eyes?
glinted a little bit there when Mom
Can you
shook him a
tell us
little
how
bit,
old
so
you
he's
are?
enjoying being around her. How old are you? He kind of said 1.
Where's your hair, Aiden?
Now he starts pointing to his hair.
Yeah, your hair.
Where are your toes?
Aiden.
Where are your toes?
That's my favorite part. Isn't that so cute?
Good.
Yeah, I know. I just love watching. I'm sorry to have to put you all through that. Now, 8 months later, we're on a family vacation in Hawaii, and I want to show you this same child.
Speech?
Can we have Mom down?
Posturing of the hand,
Yeah.
doing what kind of verbal stimming behavior, making woo. This is at the age when a child should be easily connecting words
Mom and
together.
Dad.
And he's not particularly happy to be in
Mom's
Mom's
Dad.
presence there. But you don't know whether that's because he's not happy that day or whatever. But when I was watching this was a few years later, and this son of mine had already been diagnosed with mild to moderate autistic disorder. When I, as a parent, see that 18-month versus the 26-month, it's night and day to me. The people around here who might be professionals that work with children in this space probably could notice the difference. And particularly good individuals may have even seen some things that were concerning at 18 months, but most of us probably said, oh, that's a cute little kid at 18 months. But by the time he was 26, to me, he had changed right under my nose. And I was very struck by this particular experience, and I realized that I had been spending a lot of my academic career at that point. I was a tenured associate professor, had built a reputation in ubiquitous computing for being able to instrument real environments, to record what goes on in those environments, and to allow people to go back and review those things. And it was done in really meaningful settings, like in classrooms, so people could cram for exams better than they could cram for them without these recorded lectures. And what struck me was that here was an example of a recording of my everyday experience that being able to go back and reflect was extremely informative to me. And I said, well, there's got to be more I can do as a technologist to work on problems that were meaningful both to me and to a large collection of people. And this was, again, as I said, in 2002, and that's what launched for me one consistent thread of research and looking at different ways that information technologies can be used to address the challenges of autism. So at that time, also by 2002, my second son, Blaze, who's 3 years younger than Aiden, was also diagnosed with mild to moderate autistic disorder. And in fact, we were slower in detecting him having that diagnosis because he could talk. But it took until he was around 3 for us to realize that his talking wasn't communicative. It was basically just repeating sounds and experiences he had seen in the past. Right? And now you see this is my family as of only about a month or so ago. My mother on the left there, my oldest son Aiden, and then Blaze and Mary Catherine, who's a neurotypical 6-year-old, and my wife and myself. So now, what I want to do is switch a little bit from what inspired me to do this to then talk about, well, where's the research here? Because one of the explicit message for this talk is that buried inside the challenge of trying to see how information technologies can address the opportunities and problems that I was facing and many other people face in dealing with autism are lots of opportunities for people with a computing mindset to try to address. And I just want to show you a few examples of these. But implicit in what I'm saying is that you often have to work on these problems as an individual, and it's hard to convince other people, other computing collaborators, that there's something of value here, other domain experts in autism in my case, to then try to work with you. But if you persist, it actually becomes easier over time for these collaborators to want to work with you. And I'm in a very blessed position now to have people coming to me from different computer scientists, different people in neuroscience or in a variety of clinical fields relating to autism that come to me presenting very interesting problems and wanting to know how I might help. And that's a wonderful position to be in. But the other thing is that this is not unique to autism. I'm just using the context of my experience to try to explain this to you. So you choose your own substitute of what you think you might have a passion about, or a real-world problem that you might apply your lens as a computing researcher or whatever research area you come from. And then this last point here about why it's important to be able to provide inspiration to people, but people are the ones who do the work. And I think what's very important for those who try to inspire or lead other people is that you got to do work as well. So that's Gregory's corollary. Good leaders are good individuals. You got to be part of the team. So I don't know how many people here have background or understanding of autism. My guess is that the majority of you either know someone on the spectrum or know someone who knows someone and have come in contact with them. And this is a wonderful observation to make. Yes, sir.
Could you speak a little bit about the spectrum? Are we all on it on the tail at least?
Well, that's a great. In fact, you would probably like to see what the earlier version of this particular slide was that I modified it. I think the definition of the broader autism phenotype is a pretty nebulous thing to put your fingers on. I know quite a few adults who self-identify for being on the autism spectrum, and they say the reason they like me is because I'm on the spectrum as well. And then I have other very good friends that say, no, Gregory, you couldn't possibly be on the spectrum because you're such an empathetic, feeling individual. I think it's a very difficult question to directly answer whether all of us here are on this spectrum. But the important point is that it is a spectrum, and there is such wide variability. I often react when people say, oh, people with autism love the iPad because they just love computers. I think it's more the case that there's such a wide variety of individuals on the spectrum that they represent all the different varieties that other groups. So just as some people really love the iPad, some people with autism really love the iPad. Some people really love robots, some people with autism really love robots. Some people really love art or really have a propensity toward mathematics. Some people in autism have those same things. So to kind of not answer your question but answer it, I think what's most important to understand about autism that it is so variable, and that is a wonderful thing. It's also a danger with respect to research, and I'll get onto that a little bit later. It's usually described in terms of characteristics along a number of different dimensions or phenomena. So their ability or the way they interact in social settings is different. The way they communicate is different, whether they can speak or not, or whether the way they speak and the intonations and the use of language, the facility they have with language, how they use communication is different. They also tend to have certain restricted interests, which often become a strength for these individuals. They also, as I had shown you with my son, have that whooping or the posturing of the hand. They have certain repetitive behaviors or stereotypical behaviors that many of us also exhibit. If you ever see me sitting and talking to people, I often shake my leg like this because that's just the way I kind of keep myself relaxed. So those kind of stereotypies that individuals with autism often exhibit are ones that are seen by most others as not as socially appropriate. It's highly individualized with both genetic and environmental components probably figuring into why one person gets diagnosed with autism and another person doesn't. And there's more that we don't know about it than what we do know. And I know only a fraction of what is known about autism. So now what I want to do is talk about some examples where computing research can actually contribute to a focus on trying to address some challenge that's motivated by autism. And I've thrown a couple of categories up here, and I'm going to talk about, in reverse order, the first two items up here. First, I'll talk about data collection to support collaboration and evidence-based discussion about the effectiveness of interventions, because that's what I started working on when I got into this area. Then looking at the problem of early detection of developmental delay, and I'll give some motivation for why those problems are of interest from the domain's perspective, and then what you might do as a technologist to address those particular problems. But there's also some things, if I have time, I'll talk about some specific interventions we've tried to design for the individual, specifically looking at how you can help train social skills or problem solving in social situations with the individuals, how you might better understand the autism phenotype, so you could address the question, well, is everyone on is this a continuum that describes all of humanity and we just have different extremes of that? We don't have the ability to describe this phenotype in order to be able to answer that question. And then something I'm very interested, mainly because I'm a parent who has children going into adulthood, and I'm worried for their independence and quality of life when their mother or father may or may not be around. So let's start with this first one. And I'm going to list these opportunities, and the tagline I'm going to give when I list an opportunity is saying, okay, from a computing perspective, where's the challenge or opportunity? So here we're looking at supporting human decision making, which is a valuable research endeavor for people in HCI. Many of us look at ways we might allow collaboration or decision making to be supported by the things we do in performing a particular kind of work. But it's going to be couched in terms of where does human decision making, where is it relevant in the domain of autism? And I've shown here a little graphic that's essentially a life cycle of care for an individual, and this is a life cycle that's presented by Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, and what they consider important in dealing with any child, illness, disorder, disease, or wellness. You often have a notion of screening to be able to determine whether people are at risk for any particular condition or that would need to be treated or at least monitored. And then that leads into some formal diagnosis that often has many different perspectives being able to come in so that you can characterize exactly what this individual is like with respect to this thing they've been identified as being at high risk for. And then you develop a plan, a treatment plan, and go through this kind of cycle of doing interventions or treatments and monitoring the effectiveness of those treatments so you can determine whether you need to continue with a course of medication or with occupational therapy or speech therapy. So it's that cycle that we're going to be dealing with in this first section. And then you worry about how do you provide continuity of care outside of clinical and educational settings so that people can transition into an independent adult life. So that's the continuum. We're going to be focusing on this middle part here where when you know you have an individual with autism and you're performing some kind of treatment or intervention aimed to improve some aspect of that child's life, how do you help a collection of people, including the parents, decide whether the intervention is working or if it's not working, how it needs to be changed. So I'm going to do this in the context of a particular set of treatments that are referred to as evidence-based interventions. And this is a very loaded political term, evidence-based interventions, because if you are going to get insurance companies to compensate you for the cost of speech therapy or occupational therapy, most states are now considering passing laws that will force insurance companies to pay them only if the interventions are evidence-based. So there is some study that's been done to show the effectiveness of this particular kind of intervention for this kind of child to get this kind of outcome. So evidence-based interventions is very important for people that think they have some solution to help these individuals. They need to be able to provide this evidence. And so data becomes very important, but it's really, many times, it's often hard to collect, it's hard to tabulate, it's hard to analyze and make decisions based on it. I've just shown you a couple of examples from the studies we did going as far back as 2003, just looking at, well, what are the kinds of records that people keep? You'd go into houses and you'd see some families that would just have stacks and stacks of notebooks of, these are all the school records and these are all the interventions we've been doing at home, and meticulous records that they try to pore over to make any decision about whether things have been helping or not. We looked at a particular intervention, and this is one that's called discrete trial training. It's one of the class of applied behavior analysis, or ABA techniques, and this is work done with my former student Julie Keentz, who's now at the University of Washington. And we're looking at a way to use technology to help in the collective decision process that a team of therapists working with the same child, but they're all working independently with that child. How do you support them in coming together and deciding whether they're separate but common experiences with this child are having any impact on the child? So, it boils down to being able to use technology to provide indexing into continuous video recordings of your therapy sessions so that you can easily get to episodes of therapy when you're discussing with other people. So just to give you a little bit more background here, this is a sample of the kind of record keeping that is done in this particular therapy. You have a variety. The lines here on the left show different activities or programs or tasks that you're trying to train or teach this child to be able to perform. And if you haven't worked with developmentally delayed children, you might not understand that very basic things that we take for granted, like being able to imitate a gross motor movement, are things that don't often come naturally to these individuals. And a lot of how we learn in life is by seeing examples of people performing tasks and then repeating them ourselves. So you try to build into a child this ability to repeat or copy what kinds of imitate things that someone else does. Gross movement, fine motor movements, vocal sounds, to try to build those skills. And so when you're doing these one-to-one activities with the child, you're keeping track of how the child's doing. And in this particular example, an I means that the child independently and correctly responded to the prompt that was given for this particular task. In this case, it was a vocal imitation task. So you have a number of those different things that you're doing in a 60 to 90 minute session. This is being done at least once a day in the child's life, and in this case this was being done at home. At the end of a session, you manually tabulate, okay, how many trials were performed for that particular activity and how many of them were successful. And so in this particular case, there were 3 trials. All of them were successful, so there was a 100% success rate on that particular trial. And then you'll plot for each of these lines. Each skill will have its own kind of trending plot, so you can see how is the child doing on that skill from day to day across different therapists. So a fairly well-defined, data-intensive practice of being able to keep track of what's going on so that when you meet together, you can look at the progress of the child and see, is it different people having different success? Is the child on an upward curve on a particular skill so you can make it more complicated for that child? Has he plateaued? Is he going down? Do we need to change what's going on? So when you have these do the therapy itself, this is a problem with Macs in general. They tend to be very dark when projected. I don't understand this. So here's an example of a therapist working with a child, and all I'm pulling this up to show is that there were 2 instrumentations that were done to this therapy to try to assist the technology in being able to automatically gather and produce the summary charts that were being used for the meetings. The first one was to put a head-mounted microphone on the therapist, and the reason that was done is because you're trained in this particular therapy to say a very specific utterance. If I want a child to imitate the phrase hot dog, I am trained to say, Aiden, say hot dog. Nothing else. Don't say, how about you give me a little bit of hot dog? Or why don't we try saying hot dog, Aiden? No. Aiden, say hot dog. That's how you're trained. So if that's the case, and if therapists actually obeyed their training, then it should be possible for me to spot those phrases in the transcript. And if I can spot those phrases, that's the beginning of a trial. So I have a way to use technology to index into the beginning of each trial. Sounds great? Sounds simple? Didn't work at all. Next thing we did was to use another commercially available technology. This is the Enoto technology that allows you to essentially see where you write on special dot patterns on pieces of paper, get the time in which you write, the location in which you write, and in some cases even an interpretation of what's being written. So this worked very well. And we were also leveraging the fact that the therapists were trained whenever you did a trial with a child that you were grading, you were to immediately write the grade down after the trial. So if we could get the timestamp at which you filled in a particular cell, then we'd have a good estimate for the end of a trial. And so to see the trial itself, we just need to back up a little bit. This worked really well because it wasn't relying too much on very complicated recognition technologies, and there weren't too many a variety of things you could do other than write in the piece of paper in a particular place. So that worked really well. So now what we tried to do is to say, let's look at the decision-making process, the collective discussion that a number of therapists would have with a consultant. So here's a shot in the basement of my home, and this woman in the foreground in the front, she's a consultant who's helping guide us and giving us advice about what to do. She never works with the child. So all of her information about how the child behaves is based on what's in the paper records that we give and what we say in this meeting. You'll also notice here that there's a computer on the laptop right up here, right? Because I was digitally recording all video sessions because I'm a geek, right? I do that. It was easy. The machine was just right down there. So I had all the therapists always record, but they never looked at these. And you can understand why. We have these meetings once every 2 weeks. And so there'd be 10 to 14 different therapy sessions, each of which was 90 minutes to 2 hours long. This is a meeting that lasts about 90 minutes. And by the way, I'm paying about $175 an hour to have all these people here for this meeting. So I don't want it to be a 5-hour meeting. They don't want to either, and they don't have the time to find that little bit of interaction I had with Aiden, 5 days ago when I was trying to ask him to grab something that was on the right and he kept going to the left. So people didn't do it. So we ignored the video recordings. But then we tried to replace it with, when we used the Enoto pens, at the end of a therapy session, they would dock the pen, it would upload all the data, and it would produce what was essentially a replication of the paper-based record. And let me show you that in a little bit more detail. It would show the detailed, the trending information, and each of those different looking icons represents a different therapist collecting data on a different day. So you could see at a glance what the trend was. You could hover over any given data point and it would immediately show you the detailed information, the data for that particular day that underlie the value there, in this case of a 50% rating, where that came from. And it's useful. You can interpret that data. If you know how this therapy is done, you know what that's saying. But you could do one other thing as well. You could click on a particular column and immediately bring up video that would be indexed by the various scores that were gleaned from what was written on the piece of paper. So now if I have a question about how two different therapists are performing the exact same skill with my son, we could pull it up quickly enough, and within about 15 to 20 seconds, you could compare one person doing this task to another, and you could answer the question of, are you doing things the same or are you doing them differently? And this was good because it helped us inform our discussion about what was working and what wasn't working, not solely on what was on that piece of paper or what was in our head, but in how we were actually interacting with the child. So we did lots of studies on this, and those were reported in a variety of kind of CHI and CSCW and UBComp showing how we then explored this instrumentation of the meetings and how it impacted and affected the decision-making process. It was pretty successful. But now we wanted to look at a different situation where you didn't have a very well-structured situation that you were trying to gather data from. So in this particular case, and this is work that was done with Jillian Hayes, who's now at UC Irvine. And in this case, we're looking at severe behavior problems of children in school settings. So the situation here is you've got children who are doing self-injurious behaviors, or they're escaping from class, or they're having tantrums that's disrupting the educational setting in the classroom. And what happens in public school systems is when you have a child like that and you can't overcome the behavioral problem, the child gets taken out of that classroom setting and gets put in more and more restrictive and self-contained settings. And so we actually were working with the folks that were at the bottom of the barrel in terms of behavioral problems. If they couldn't solve these problems in this school, they essentially could not educate this child and they would have to be institutionalized. So we're working in the most extreme case here in self-contained classes, and you're trying to figure out why is a child behaving in a way that's disruptive to the learning environment. And the way they do this before this kind of technology intervention is one of two ways. The first way is you take a trained behavioral someone with a master's in behavior analysis, and they go and they sit in the classroom and they observe what's going on. And they see when the particular severe behavior occurs, and they take notes of what was going on before that episode and what was going on after the episode. Because it may be something that you're doing, like you're asking them to do something that they're bored with or something that they are overwhelmed with. So it may be something you're doing that triggers it, or it may be how you're responding to the behavior. Like if a child jumps up on this on their chair and pounds on the table until you shout their name, and then they get all happy. Well, they're seeking your attention, and it's your reaction to the behavior that's actually causing a problem. But it takes someone else externally and objectively looking at these situations to help you understand where the problem is and to help you formulate a behavior intervention plan. But they need to see 10 to 20 different examples of this behavior. And if the behavior happens once a day, then they've got to come to that school many consecutive days in order to view this and be confident what the problem is. Did I mention that these are often people that are employed by the school system, and there's one of these specialists for 100 schools in a particular district. So it doesn't scale very well to have these people go and do that. So what they do instead is they create these forms and they give them to the teachers, and they say, okay, next time that that little boy starts pulling out his eye and starts bleeding, what I want you to do calmly is to pull out one of these pieces of paper, and I want you to fill out what was going on in the classroom right before he started to bleed, and what did you do in response to the child bleeding, that we can then determine what the function was behind this, so we can give you the right report. And the teacher's response to this is, I'm teaching a bunch of kids, and I need to help this child who's now bleeding, so I don't have time to fill out this form. So what they do instead is they'll pull a sheet out, and they'll put it down there, and let's say, I'll fill that out tonight when I've got some time, or at the end of the week, or the night before the parents are coming in for the emergency IEP meeting, because we're going to discuss having dismissed the child because the behavior is something we can't handle. And I'll fill out 20 of these about the 20 past incidents that I remember. So they rely a lot on their memory, which is not going to be very good. And also, often the behaviors that are occurring are when your back is turned, and so you don't even see what's going on. So we're trying to figure out how you might be able to support collection of data in this kind of setting. You don't know when the behaviors are going to occur, and you know that a behavior has occurred after it has occurred. You want to see something in the past. So the whole idea from a technology perspective is, how do you retroactively or after the fact save important video? By leveraging the people in the space. So what we did in this case is we put a number of cameras in the corners of a number of classrooms in this school, and we gave the teachers little wireless devices, and we said to them, for this particular child whose behavior we're trying to understand, when you see the behavior happen, press that button. What's going to happen is all the different cameras are going to collect up their information from a few minutes before, and they'll take a few minutes after you press that button. They're going to put them into a database, and you're going to be able to go back later and view all the different synchronized views of what was going on before, during, and after that particular incident. You could mark on here what you see before and after, and you'll do that for a variety of these incidents, and we'll be able to plot that information, and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, it's nice, this particular solution. It had a lot of nice features. One being that the teachers were given control over the recording of information. So if they were ever concerned that, oh, I wouldn't want people seeing what's going on in my classroom, well, don't press the button, and no one will see it. Also, if you did press the button and take a look at it, you could go back and analyze, but it was easy for you to then delete any of the information there, so only you saw the video, and then you would pass the report on. So by giving people that kind of control, you put them in a situation where they didn't feel like they were just being monitored and their job was on the line. They could start to appreciate the value of doing this ABC, antecedent consequent analysis, and we saw that they adopted this particular technology, and we showed that they were better at catching episodes when they used this technology versus the alternative of the piece of the paper report that they were trying to fill out. So that's the second example of being able to collect. So let's step back and say what was going on here. In both of these situations, there wasn't a lot of technology being used. You were leveraging a human in the space who was trying to either cause a particular kind of learning to happen or was trying to observe a particular phenomenon, and you were giving them the ability to relatively easily select information that you could then reflect on later. In the case of the discrete trial, while you're interacting with the child, so while things are being recorded, or as we say in the UbiComp world, captured, we were annotating it to provide useful ways to index into and reflect on it, but that was in a meeting that you would reflect much later on. In the case of CareLog, where we're trying to capture things, you would do the indexing after the relevant behavior, and then you would go and be able to annotate and reflect much later in the past. But these are both examples of technology allowing humans in the situation to do simple kind of annotation that would support the data collection and evidence-based decision making. Next question we've looked at is, well, can you do what we did in a school in a home? Can parents collect this kind of information after the fact, information relating to behaviors? And I won't go into too much detail here, but this is actually work being done with the Marcus Autism Center in Atlanta, and there's an economic incentive to wanting parents to collect evidence of severe behavior that's happening at home. If you don't do that, what the Marcus Center typically did was would have people drive all the way to Atlanta to their center. Their child would be put in an observation room for a 2-hour period, and they would cross their fingers and hope the behavior would be demonstrated, and then the experts would be watching, would try to figure out what's going on. If that didn't work, drive all the way back to Atlanta, and someday in the future, or to your home, someday in the future, Marcus would dispatch one of their staff to go to your house for 2 hours. While they were at your house, they wouldn't cross their fingers, they would provoke the behavior. They would cause the child to do the behavior that you're saying is the problem, and they would record it, and they'd take it back, and they would analyze to see, okay, what program would we suggest for your child? So you'd get the data there, but you'd question whether it was natural because it was being provoked. An alternative to this is, could you give the parents some technology that they could install in their own home, give them however much time they want, and say all you need to do is when you see the behavior, press the button, and we'll collect a period of time before and after that, and then just ship that all back to us and we'll take a look at it. So the Marcus folks were interested in this working, but they said, we're not going to invest in any solution unless we believe the parents are any good at pressing the button. Well, we did a study over the last year, and the results were okay. There certainly were behavioral episodes that the parents were catching, but we did this as a research study, so we didn't just selectively archive. We recorded everything, and we went back to find episodes that the parents missed. And there were a lot of them. And the question is, are the parents not motivated? Do they not understand what it means to observe this behavior? And if that's the case, could you train them to do a better job? Or could you, from a technology perspective, find certain triggers that are happening with these episodes and collect the selective archived information based on, if you're looking for a biting behavior, if someone says, don't bite, okay, that's the trigger. I don't have to explicitly press a button. I can detect those kinds of behaviors occurring. So that's where that work is going. So now I want to step back. So that was how do you support decision making and ways you can leverage people in the environment and build technological solutions that are not complicated but provide valuable information for people to reflect on. And you have to take into account that recording people in natural environments it raises lots of privacy concerns, so you have to be sensitive about giving them control over what gets recorded and what doesn't get recorded. Now we're going to go to a different challenge. This one's looking at how automated activity recognition can advance some cause relating to autism. And we're going to look at the problem of how do you do early detection or screening of people that are at risk. So there's a lot of reason why CDC and other organizations try to advocate for parents and pediatricians being very alert to developmental progress of children. One of the reasons is because we believe, and there's now evidence to show this, that if you have early detection followed by early intervention, you have more favorable outcomes across the lifetime for the individual. So the earlier we spot a developmental deviation, the sooner we're able to do something for the family and for the individual. But diagnosis is based on two phenomena. One is parents reporting after the fact how their child behaved over some period in the past. You know, parent of a 4-year-old being asked how did the child behave when he or she was 2. So parent report is one way the diagnosis is done. The other one is by bringing a child into a clinical setting, the pediatrician or the neurologist's office, and being observed. So again, a non-natural setting, and you're trying to make a diagnosis for a child based on 5 minutes of direct observation. So we were saying, what could technology do to support the problems of parent report and the problems of direct clinical observation in an unnatural setting? So we did a number of different things. I'll very quickly talk about the top branch here. This was work also done by Julie Keynes as part of her thesis work, where we used the notion of the technologies that people use to monitor children, like baby monitors. How might they be instrumented to capture evidence of developmental growth, but also the use of baby calendars, things that some families have, that the purpose for which is to produce this heirloom that shows you when milestones were met for your particular child. So there are some practices that we already have that would be useful if we could get them to collect the right kind of information at the right time. So how might you produce kind of persuasive technologies that would encourage families who are busy raising a child to collect information that a pediatrician would like to know during the 9-month or the 12-month or 15-month well-child visit? And that was pretty successful. But then it also begged this question, what might you do that's more automated? So let's move away a little bit from getting the individual in the scene to do all this annotation. Let's figure out what could be done automatically. And this is the second branch here. This was explored in 2 different ways with 2 recently graduated PhD students. Tracy Weston, who worked with myself, and Thad Starner, who does a lot of work in wearable and wireless sensors embedded in objects. She explored the problem of if you put wireless sensors in toys, could you look at the stream of data that comes from a collection of toys and sensors embedded in these toys and determine something about how a child is playing with these objects? Because there was plenty of evidence to show that children who experience developmental delay, that gets manifest in the sophistication of their play with objects. Are they doing accidental? Are they doing exploration with the object? Are they doing relational actions, putting something on top of something else? Are they doing functional actions with these? So if you watch a child play with an expert's eye, you can see those kinds of behaviors, and you notice, they have noticed, that children with developmental delay do not show the higher level forms of play as early as typically developing children. So we asked this question, could you find that out automatically from the sensors that come from embedded inside toys? The next example was getting at how do you observe a child's interaction, social interaction with the rest of the world? So when you bring a child in for direct clinical observation, one of the things they try to do is engage the child socially. Try to say the child's name, try to tickle the child, try to get them to look at you in the eye or to look at a shared object and get them to follow directions. Well, these are the kinds of things that happen all the time at home or in school. And if you have home movies of a child, the question is, could you filter out from years of home movies snippets that show examples of social interaction? More interestingly, snippets that show examples of opportunities for social interaction that were not demonstrated, so that if you show that to a pediatrician, that would say, well, this is what the child's like in everyday life, rather than trying to do this 5 or 10 minute observation in the office. These become very interesting machine learning and computer vision challenges. So what was the result of the toy? Yeah, so the result of the toy was twofold. You can get a reasonable amount of confidence of classifying the incidental, the exploratory and the relational. We don't have a prayer of being able to get functional use because that involves a lot more of the semantics of the items being used. So this is a hammer, and so it's being used as a hammer. So you have to introduce a lot of information into the system about, oh, that sensor's in a hammer, and is it being used as a hammer? But relational play is extremely important, and we could detect the presence or absence of relational play when adults were staged in using these toys, and then when children were actually, because it's actually very difficult to do these studies with children, to get them in for 2 hours to do a fixed protocol. So we did a lot of the original work with adults to train the system, and then applied it to the children's one. But you don't get anywhere near what a human expert would get in looking at a child play with these things. So the next question that Tracy looked at was, well, let's accept what's imperfect about these sensing technologies. If you used it to index into recorded video, could you help someone scan 2 hours of video and find the 13 episodes of play and to be able to characterize those appropriately? So she showed that you were much better at being able to do what researchers and what hopefully clinicians might do in terms of being able to rapidly scan a large volume of video to find the episodes of interest. Okay? But I'm going to come back to what real impact this has. But first, what I want to do is talk a little bit more about video mining of social interactions and talk about how this became a very interesting problem for computer vision researchers and probably my first real success at engaging someone other than myself at wanting to really dive into a problem and seeing all the opportunities here. So here you're trying to figure out, I want to extract examples of social interactions or social games that are present in the video here. And so I have some examples on the bottom here. A peekaboo game. You all kind of know what peekaboo is. You hide yourself, you wait for anticipation of the child, then you reveal yourself, and you hope the child responds in a positive or at least in a surprised manner. So how would you be able to extract an example of that, or patty cake, or being able to tickle a child or play the So Big game? How would you grab that from unstructured videos in home movies? So we first tried grabbing lots of examples of these classic social games on YouTube and seeing, well, if we throw a bunch of those games in there, can we identify when and where they're occurring? And then we said, well, can you do the same thing on this that 30-year archive of my family movies that I talked about initially? And what's interesting about this and why this became a computer vision problem was because I tried to work with computer vision researchers for a long time, and I have failed miserably, usually because I either present to them a problem that's too easy, meaning they can't publish the results in the communities that they care about, or it's too hard, meaning they don't have a prayer of being able to do anything that I would find useful because I've just given them a problem that's too hard. So you have to find a problem that is hard but not too hard, right? So it took some time, but we found examples of a problem that's hard but not too hard. And here the challenge was being able to extract these patterns of social back and forth between a child and another child, or a child and an adult, in a way where you didn't give the system that was trying to select these, filter out these episodes, you didn't give the system any knowledge about who's in the scene or about what kinds of social interactions you're looking for. So it's unsupervised learning to try to find these patterns of interaction. So no need to predefine activities, no need to learn a vocabulary of actions, and you automatically, in addition, not only find examples of social interaction, but you can parse that social interaction into different stages of activity, regardless of what the game was. And how this works was essentially trying to define what are quasi-periodic activities. So I'm just going to explain to you what this means in the context of an example of peekaboo. So typically what you do is you engage the child's interest, and then you hide something. In this case, I'm playing peekaboo with an object, so a toy that I'm hiding from the child. And then you will wait for the child to reach and show some level of expectation, and then you will reveal or make the object or yourself reappear. So that's the repeated set of stages that define peekaboo. But the challenge is that there are many variations to this. I can do a peekaboo by putting the object here or putting it there. I'm just trying to get it out of the sight of the child. So I can't rely on where the toy is being hidden. I also can do very different pacing of this. I can hold it here for a really long time because I'm trying to get the child to get more and more anxious and then reveal it, or it can be very quick. So it's not periodic, but it is repeated. The other thing that defines this is that lots of other random and unexpected events can occur. So we might have an example of this is playing peekaboo with a towel that's being put over the individual and then being revealed. So it's still peekaboo. It has the hiding and the revealing, but it's a different set of objects and different people. But also in between this, you might do other things with the towel, like I handed it to someone else or I turned it around or something, and that's not part of the game. So you've got to figure out how to find the instances of peekaboo when it can be so variable, but it follows this pattern of repeated activities. And what is published in the two of the major vision conferences, CVPR and ICCV, is this notion of defining what quasi-periodicity is and showing that it can be used using spatial temporal heuristics on the volumes of video. You can show that you can determine when there are parts of a video that are correlated to other parts of the video in a certain sequence. You can go further than that as well. You can isolate where in a video frame you have related and unrelated patterns of interaction. So I'll give you a quick example of how that might happen. I might be playing patty cake with someone, and it's outside, and there's a tree that is swaying back and forth, right? That tree swaying back and forth, maybe it's there's a garage back there. That's going to look like quasi-periodic behavior, but it's not linked causally, or it doesn't correlate in space and time to the actions of the people playing the patty cake. So what I can do is say, oh, there's a spatio-temporal pattern here, a quasi-periodic pattern here, that's the patty cake, and there is another pattern over there, and a human can easily dismiss that other one as not being relevant, and I can hone in on the piece that's actually correlates to itself. So you can do a reasonably good job of being able to filter out where the quasi-periodic motion occurs, and humans do a very good job of recognizing false positives and the false positives in this particular case. False negatives, we don't do a good job because we don't see the false negatives. So this was good. I was really happy because it was a great vision problem. Jim Ray, my colleague in this, just absolutely loves this problem. He says, because all these vision people, we don't work on really hard problems. We have all these stage things. We never try to grab these things from home movies. We might see Fred Astaire dancing in a particular movie or people shaking in a movie, but we never do kind of extended interaction. So it was a great problem, but it wasn't too hard. So he could show results and had oral presentations at the two top conferences in vision. And if you know anything about these conferences, oral presentations are the top 5% of papers. They don't let everyone present. So this means that it was work that was seen as being done well and a relevant problem. It had a great motivation. We want to do early detection. Yeah.
Was there audio here? Because often
No, this is not. This is single mode. So I'll get on to the notion of being able to use multimodal. So that's a great question. This is just looking at the video, right? Because computer vision folks seem to think that they have their own techniques for handling video, and they're not the same as what the audio folks do. That's perplexing to me, but that's the case. This had a great motivation because the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, this is a bunch of people from NIH and other organizations that fund research and advocacy organizations like Autism Speaks and whatever, that are really concerned about solving the right problems. One of their #1 objectives for research over the next few years is to come up with a cost-effective way to do screening for early detection. So technology that's trying to get at this screening problem is really well motivated. However, if we think a little bit about what is actually being done in this research versus what you really want, well, I could give you an argument about someday you'll be able to point to a web service with all of your home movies and it'll come back with 13 little snippets that you can then shoot along to your pediatrician and they'll look and say, looks okay, right? I could say that. We could also create a set of toys someday that would be in the waiting room of a pediatrician's office, and when you go for your well child visit, your child gets this set of toys, goes off and plays with themselves while you're waiting for the doctor. Meanwhile, the sensor data is being analyzed, and when you go into the doctors, they can say, yep, you're showing the right kind of play behaviors. I could give you that story, but I'm not so sure that we're close enough to actually be able to do that. Part of the problem is that it's the quality of these behaviors that often matters. And the false negatives also matter in the sense that you want to see the absence. It's that false negative is the wrong way to characterize it. You want to see the absence of social interaction. So being able to show that you've got social interactions is often not the issue. It's the absence of those things. And these technologies weren't really geared at discovering the lack of certain critical behaviors. But there's another angle on this. And this is one that we've just recently convinced the National Science Foundation to invest in. And I'm going to build this by analogy. If you look at a lot of medical fields, they have made tremendous strides when imaging technologies have been introduced into both the clinical practice and the research behind those fields. So we have examples here of X-ray and how it transformed the practice and research in orthopedics and dentistry because you could see things that were otherwise difficult to see. Same thing with echocardiogram or MRIs and CTs addressing the advances in cardiology and neurology. Okay, so what about for behavior? Is there something you could provide behavioral sciences that would allow the quantitative and objective study of development and cognitive phenomena? And we're saying, well, imaging for behavior or behavior imaging should play this role. And so we've recently gotten funding from the National Science Foundation for an expeditions project which is looking at computational behavioral science. It's building objective and quantitative tools that use multimodal versions of sensing, so vision with audition, with on-body, autonomic, and physiological sensing, together allowing you to observe and understand and measure and quantify and characterize human behavior, with the driving application being issues in autism, early screening and monitoring of behaviors. And we've been very fortunate to put together a team of top-notch computer vision researchers, computer speech researchers, on-body autonomic researchers, and developmental psychologists working together to try to attack this particular problem. But it's more than just having a good team. Having a good team, the team needs to be steered in the right direction. So here's what we've been doing, trying to essentially look at this notion of early screening as a concrete example of how you can build tools to help you quantify what it means to have a developmental delay with respect to social communication. So we've created with colleagues at the Emory Autism Center a behavioral assessment that would be used for children under the age of 2. That's the goal, the goal of the American Academy of Pediatricians. 2 screenings for risk of developmental delay before the age of 2. We want to look at their attention and affect. We want to look at their back and forth interaction with adults, and we want to look at their communication abilities. And these are usually pre-verbal communications, so things like pointing as well as verbalizations. And we want to do these quickly. So that's where the name Rapid ABC comes from. We want to be able to do this assessment in less than 5 minutes in the context of a well child visit, or maybe even in the waiting room prior to a well child visit. And we want this to be boiled down to a simple one-page protocol that can be executed by non-experts. So despite the fact that pediatricians have a lot of training, most of them do not have a lot of expertise in identifying developmental delay. So even a pediatrician is considered a non-expert here, but it might be a nurse working in the pediatrician's office, or a social worker who's there to do things. So people who are well-intentioned but might also not have the training to recognize developmental delay. So this is a backdrop of the kind of screening that we do, and all I want to show you here is that you have a therapist sitting down here, or the observer, you have the child, and you have the child's parents sitting at a table, and down here you've got a one-page piece of paper that's telling this screener or therapist exactly what to do with the child. And you work with simple objects like a ball and a book. There's this one-page sheet looks like this and says, as you go from top to bottom doing 10 specific things with this child, you're to grade in this little sheet over here whether the child was successful at that step or not. And it's broken up into these 4 different sections, and for each section you say, how hard was it for you to engage the child? So very simple, on a scale of 1 to 3 ratings that you do in this protocol. So that's what we've developed with the folks at the Emory Autism Center, but this is still all human-driven. So the step for the Expeditions project is to say, okay, how could we observe that relatively structured interaction and determine things like the synchronicity between the speaking of a child's name by an adult and the response of the child to that. The presentation of an object, a ball, in the environment, and the ability for the child to demonstrate joint attention, looking at the object and then looking at the adult. How can you measure and identify those particular activities? And I hope you would see with me that this is related to the kinds of measurements we were doing earlier when trying to do the video mining of social interactions, but in a sense, because it's a staged interaction, it's a little easier. But now what we want to do is not just find those interactions, we want to measure them. We want to know the lag between the call of the child's name and the child attending. We also have autonomic sensors, a little wristwatch here that does galvanic skin response and heart rate. And we want to see internally what's going on in the child so we can tell the difference between a child who is passive, meaning you say their name and there's no response, versus a child who is shy, which might be indicated by the call of the name. The child might not look, but the heart rate might go up, showing you that they're actually afraid to look, but they do recognize that something was going on. There's something very important and meaningful in those kind of distinctions, and it's lost when you only go on looking at the child's affect and other visual cues. So that's it for that opportunity of how we can engage multimodal activity recognition to support screening. Now what I want to do, what's our, I see 10 to 2. 2:05, and that's for me to blather on, and then you get to ask questions. Oh, okay, so it's good for me to wrap up fairly quickly here. I just want to quickly show you some other example, but you can ask your questions, Steve. Yeah.
What are the risks of either missing a case, like not recognizing that there's
Right,
a
so
problem
what we
there, or the false
Right, so false positives, false negativities, which for these folks in the clinical world, they refer to the specificity and, what's the other S word? Oh, I can't remember. But basically the false positive, false negative rate. So this is being done as a screener. So what you're trying to do is find people that are high risk. This is not a diagnostic. You would then refer these people to do a battery of more well-accepted ones to give someone a diagnosis. So what you're looking at is here you're less worried about false positives because those will be caught later on. You're much more worried about false negatives because they say, oh, everything's fine and everything is not fine. So what you want to do is be hypersensitive so that you overestimate. It's better to do that, to be overreactive than to be underreactive. So to understand this distinction between it being used as a screener versus a diagnostic. Okay, so quickly I'm just going to talk about some other opportunities, and this is something that's focused for the people that came here from the Children's Health Council. We've been doing some work on how you might train social skills by giving children interactive storytelling environments, and I have a website that I can show you that allows a child to go through a social situation into which has been interjected problems that occur, and you're asking the child at a particular problem point, what should you do next? And the skill you're trying to teach them is that you might not understand why you do things, but you want to understand the repercussions of if I'm at a movie theater and I come up to buy the ticket and it's sold out, it's not good to just stand there, right? Because people will look at you. It's also not good to just yell at everyone around you because the security guard may escort you out. It's appropriate for you to step out of line and to consider what your options might be. So to teach children that they have the opportunity to stop when there's something that doesn't go as planned, which happens a lot in life, and consider your options and consider the ramifications of those options, and then to reflect on what it means to pass through a particular scenario like that. So this is nice, and we built a tool that had 3 different episodes, and it's pretty encouraging people's reaction to this particular tool. But it's extremely hard to develop the right kinds of scenarios and inject the right kinds of problems that happen throughout. There's a great opportunity for people that work in AI that look at narrative generation to say, how might you automatically create examples of everyday interactions, and how might you find decision points where things may not go the way you plan? And when you find that decision point, what are the options that you might explore? So how can you automatically generate these kinds of rich scenarios to allow an individual to practice their social skills without having to fail in the real world first? There's another example, and this is looking at what cognitive science might be able to contribute. So there are lots of very interesting first-person accounts in autism. The one that most people tend to know about is Temple Grandin's book on thinking in pictures. But there are many other books that have been written by people who have been able to be successful in life while being on the autism spectrum. And it's very interesting how those might influence us as researchers. So in this particular case, there's some nice observations that individuals on the autism spectrum perform better on visually oriented, nonverbal tests of intelligence. The Raven's progressive matrices test is an example of it, versus the standard IQ tests that rely a lot on our symbolic understanding and manipulation of language. So from a cognitive science perspective, what does it mean to distinguish between nonverbal and visual problem solving versus symbolic problem solving? What is visual reasoning? And can you produce an example of visual reasoning? Can you create a program that acts as if it is doing visual reasoning so you could solve the Raven's progressive matrix? And if you could do that, could you figure out a way to take any kind of educational material and turn it from being, and determine whether it's requiring symbolic skills versus visual skills? And in the case where you would want it to be all symbolic, how could you convert it to be something that's all symbolic? In the case where you'd want it to be all visual, how could you convert it to be entirely visual? And this is actually the subject of a PhD student, Maitli Kunda, who's been publishing this work in the Cog-Sci field over the last 2 years. That's a little bit more about how she thinks about it. Other examples, and I'll just stop at this point. This is actually work that started here at Stanford a few years ago. Anne-Marie Piper, who was a master's student here, did work on how you might teach social skills like turn-taking using the technologies of surface or tabletop interaction, where that technology has some interesting advantages where you can touch at multiple points, but the diamond touch technology she was using had the additional advantage that you could distinguish between different people interacting with the table. So when you have technology that does that, you can actually produce games that behave differently depending on who is touching the table. So you can force people to have to take turns and seed the table. And she did this with a school local to here, trying to see if you could encourage turn-taking by technology that enforces the right kind of behavior. I have a lot of colleagues that work in robotics, and they're becoming increasingly interested in the robotics space. A grand challenge that the robotics community talks about is we want a teacher for every child. So we're going to have a robot be every child's teacher, and that's going to solve all our educational problems. I go, okay, why not start with the kind of teaching that we are in dire need of in this country, and that's special education or exceptional children. Because often the kinds of drills that you need to do with these children are very repetitive and onerous, and the people who get those jobs are very low paid, very low motivated, and they have tremendous turnover. Okay, so people don't want those jobs, and yet we have some evidence to show the effectiveness of it. So get your robots to do that kind of teaching first. There's a lot of opportunity for visualization and analysis of video that lets you hone in on relevant portions of an interaction for a child. We're doing a study with the Emory Autism Center right now where we're trying to determine the social subtype of a child. There are children who avoid interacting with other people. There are children who are completely passive, so no matter what's going on around them, they say they're not affected by what's around them. And there are children who gravitate toward a social interaction. So knowing what kind of category a child falls in by just observing their everyday behavior in a daycare would be very valuable in their setting because they're monitoring certain children that are at risk. And they want to know if you're an avoidant or a passive child, there are different strategies you would use to engage those children. And the last thing, which is about how to help with transition to adulthood. There are lots of uses of online communities for various populations and for health. And there are a number of them that are actually populated by a number of adults on the spectrum. And there's many opportunities to see how these kinds of forums can be used to influence other activities. Like you can look at these discussions and automatically extract out the scenarios and the problems that people have in social interactions to feed that social skills training tool I was talking about. But what other things might you do to help individuals feel more independent and have quality of life that would allow them to live without their parents? That's all I wanted to talk about. I'll just quickly show you the many people who have both inspired the work I do, supported it financially, and moved on to their own independent careers. And I have other morals to talk about, but I think it's best to just stop and I'll let you ask questions.
I've got a question about some of the privacy concerns that you raised, and wondering, in your personal experience working with some of the families that you've worked with, how concerned are they with sharing the information, that, especially coming out of their home? Are they
Not very.
really clamped down, or are they like anything that's going to help is great?
Yeah, when you're dealing with parents who are desperate for any kind of solution, you tend to weigh things in life. And anything that could potentially help my child, I'm often willing to give up a certain amount of privacy or autonomy with respect to that. It's particularly true in a school setting where you have a self-contained classroom, so all the children typically have some issue that they're dealing with. Getting consent from all the people, all the families in that classroom to allow you to observe one particular child, not difficult. What's difficult is dealing with the parents who do not have children that would directly benefit from this kind of research. Those are the ones that say, well, I don't want pictures of my children showing up on YouTube, so I won't consent to you doing this kind of study. And we live in a very litigious society, so people, administrators that are concerned about lawsuits that might be pressed because of observation of inappropriate handling of children in a classroom. So I think inclusion settings are going to be very difficult for these technologies to work, and that's unfortunately where they're probably most needed. But in terms of gathering evidence from homes, of parents that have these children and in self-contained settings, we've never had a problem with people consenting for that. It's because, you know, you see the value, potential value of that.
It would seem as though, first of all, with respect to teacher mentoring, say, there might be a general value for this sort of thing, which might kind of get around this.
Yeah, well, so all the other kind of uses of this. Yep.
And in this case, the teacher's reaction, perhaps there's an annotation phase, then there's a consultation with the mentor, and a diagnostic of the teacher.
Right.
And this has this sort of...
So when we show this to teachers, they often say, oh gosh, this would be great for training purposes. So I can show how someone who is experienced handles this particular skill or handles this particular behavior. We also saw in the case of the care log system that teachers saying watching their own behavior in class was informative for them. So even though they were looking to see what precipitated a headbanging incident, they would make other observations like, oh boy, my voice sounds like that. I get awfully short toward the end of the day. Those kind of reflective things are useful for individuals. And if you know, it's once they start to see those the kind of value of those things, they feel like they have more ownership and stake in what the technology is trying to do. Help them teach, help them help another child. I mean, most people that are involved in special education really do want to help the kids. And they want to use technologies or any solution that will make things better. It's just often these things are foisted upon them without them really being told how they might help. Like, you know, just fill out this piece of paper because the parents are coming in next week. So.
Also feel more accepting of technologies like CareLog, even though there are other kids that might be in that classroom, just because they know that there's a potential for helping a wider audience in doing themselves.
I can't speak authoritatively on that because I can certainly say that in the case of CareLog, we had one individual who was absolutely freaked out by cameras, and so ended up having to be removed from the study, the technology removed from that classroom, because no matter what we did, this individual did not want to be in front of the camera. But that's not exactly what you're trying to... You were trying to say... I guess I don't quite understand what your question was.
Well, was the setting within special education students or kids altogether, or was it just sort of a traditional classroom?
Oh no, it was a teacher and typically one or more paraprofessionals and 8 to 10 other children, all of whom, in this case, all of whom had a severe behavior issue. So it's sure, because they could see how it would be there to help them, because a behavior intervention plan is to help the child, but also to help the teacher be able to work with the child to teach rather than to have to address serious behaviors. So yeah, they were bought into why you'd want to have this kind of solution. So I had this little moral here. There's one other thing, since we've got a few moments and you haven't showered me with questions. One last sidebar I want to say. I was reading this paper earlier this week, and I have really changed my tune on this over the last year or so because I've been with a number of adults on the spectrum. But if you read this passage and you're an individual that has a diagnosis of autism, what do you think about yourself if this is the language that's being used to describe you? All of these negative words, you have a disorder. So I no longer refer to it as autism spectrum disorder, even though that's what the clinicians and the professionals, I refer to it, I'm much more comfortable with autism spectrum, autism or autism spectrum phenomenon. Calling it a disorder, for these individuals, they take that as an insult, saying that they are reduced, they're abnormal, they're dysfunctional, they have rigidities, they're deviant. And this was in the first paragraph of a paper by people doing automated speech analysis. This is how they were basically parroting the language in the literature that they were reading. And I just want to let everyone else here know, this is a little soapbox I'm on, that the words we use matter. We are talking about people here. And that I hope you would agree in looking at that those are rather negative terms. And in some cases, some of the behaviors they're describing here are actually strengths of these individuals. They're not abnormalities, or they're not negative, dysfunctional capabilities. So just, I'll end with that little sidebar. Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.